Hello everyone. So, actual photograph there to start this off from a lynching in the 1930s in one of the southern states of the U.S. I think it's Mississippi. I could look to get more information about it. So this is the second part of a series that I wish I didn't believe I have to do, but I do believe I have to do it. What's going on recently is there's been a lot of very problematic behavior within what I'm calling the so-called progressive movement. So that's why I'm doing this series. Again, as I stated real quick in my last part, the first part of the series, Racism 101 for white people, that American black issues are progressive issues, and progressives, if they are truly progressives, should be out front fighting for issues of justice. And of course, when it comes to U.S. history, one of the most important parts of justice, I firmly believe, is the fight for racial justice. And justice and equality are not the same thing. A really cool meme that was going around for a while has three kids of different heights trying to look over into a baseball field to watch a baseball game going on, and they're like way out in the outfield fence. The kids are of very different heights though. So they show what is called equality, and you have the three kids standing on the same height boxes. And then the next frame is justice. And that shows the really tall kid really didn't need a box at all. So he's able to peek over the fence because he's really tall. Then there's the medium height kid, and he's standing on one box. So he can look over the fence and see the game. And then the third kid is really short. So he's on top of two boxes. So he can also watch the game, the same as his two other friends. So that's equality. That's justice. That's justice, to all be able to see the same game, to all participate in society at the same level. That is justice. When you have a history of injustice, of systematic racism based on white supremacy, which is really the core foundation of the U.S. empire. Once that's combated and fully addressed, then we can have justice in this country. And for progressives to go about saying, oh, well, this is just bogging us down. Let's get to the issues that are important today. Like all that stuff, like what you're trying to say, we're still like an early 20th century? No, we're not trying to say we're early 20th century. We're saying that there's never truly been racial justice here. There's never been, a resolution on this. And what's happening now is you have figures within the so-called progressive movement trying to sweep it all under the rug. And of course, that's just making the situation that much worse. So let me jump in here. I think as I was promoting this, I stated, if we don't know our own history, we're doomed to make the same mistakes. So it's very important to know a little bit about our history. So here, we're going to jump right on in here. Let's see.
Slavery in the United States dates back to August 1619. That's when the first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. They came from the Portuguese colony of Angola in Western Africa. The ship they were aboard was bound for Mexico, but the slaves were stolen by two English ships. Once in Virginia, the enslaved Africans were dispersed throughout the colony. Although Virginia was the first British colony to legally recognize slavery in the mid-1600s, slavery did not immediately become the predominant form of labor there. For decades after slavery was formalized, Virginia's plantation owners held nearly 10 times as many indentured servants as enslaved Africans, and many of them were white. By the 1680s, African slave labor became the dominant system on Virginia farms, and the slave population continued to grow exponentially. At the start of the Civil War in 1861, Virginia had the largest population of enslaved black people of any state in the Confederacy.
So thanks for joining me, everyone. Share this out if you can. I've picked the period of 1619, which we saw in that little video there, was when the first slaves were brought to, popularly believed to be when the first slaves were brought to North America, the Jamestown colony in Virginia. And then in the last decade, a little more detail was found out about that group of slaves. So I'm going to read you a little bit of an article here. It's pretty interesting. About a decade ago, they learned more detail. So I read this article. Jamestown. They were known as the 20 and odd, the first African slaves to set foot in North America at the English colony settled in 1607. For nearly 400 years, historians believed they were transported to Virginia from the West Indies on a Dutch warship. Little else was known of the Africans who left no trace. No new scholarship and transatlantic detective work have solved the puzzle of who they were and where their forced journey across the Atlantic began. The slaves were herded onto a Portuguese slave ship in Angola in southwest Africa. The ship was seized by British pirates on the high seas, not brought to Virginia after a period of time in the Caribbean. The slaves represented one ethnic group, not many, as historians first believe. The discovery has tapped a rich vein of history that will now go on public view next month at the Jamestown settlement. The museum and living history program will commemorate the 400th anniversary of Jamestown's founding by revamping the exhibits and artifacts, as well as the story of the settlement itself. Although historians have thoroughly documented the direct slave trade from Africa starting in the 1700s, far less was known of the first blacks who arrived in Virginia and other colonies a century earlier. A story of memory and cultural connections between Africa and the early New World is being unearthed in a state whose plantation economy set the course for the Civil War. We went entirely back to the drawing board, said Tom Davidson, senior curator of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. The problem has always been that all the things that make for a human story, in brackets, of the Africans, were missing. Now we can talk about the Africans with the same richness we talk about the English and the Powhatans. Behind him, an Angolan man was depicted stripping bark from a baobab tree in a recreated village featured in the museum's new 30,000-foot gallery, which will open October 16th. This was way back in, 10 years ago, 2006. It's double the space of the previous one to cover a long span of the 17th century and the African story, which was barely featured before. How the story of the chartered generation of the Africans of Virginia has come to life, a new 25 million museum wing is a tale of two scholars who helped connect two coasts of the Atlantic Ocean. The early 1600s was a time of war and empire building in southwest Africa. Portuguese traders, under the rule of the King of Spain, had established the colony of Angola. The exporting of slaves to the Spanish New World was a profitable enterprise. The Portuguese waged war against the kingdoms of Nengo and Congo to the north, capturing and deporting thousands of men and women. They passed through a slave fortress at the port city of Luanda, still Angola's capital. So there you have it. You have the very beginning of the slave trade to what was called, or properly called by historians the New World, which really wasn't a new world. There was a huge, civilization of Native Americans, of many, many nations, actually, that were already here. So it's pretty interesting. They started to learn more about this first group. And as said in the video, indentured servitude was actually like a bigger deal. Like a plantation owner in that time period up to I think the 1750s, 1760s, the plantation owners owned only one slave for every 10 indentured servants. And so indentured servants usually served a 10 to 15 year term to sort of buy their freedom, essentially, their release from indenturedhood. But then as plantations grew and really the early frontier, really, which was West Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, a little bit of Ohio, a little bit of Tennessee, that's the early frontierhood. As land expanded and as the some of the plantations also grew in size, cotton, tobacco being the two largest, but also sugar, a lot of sugar actually, plantations down in the Caribbean. As those all expanded, then of course slavery really began to take off in a major way. And so from the system of white supremacy, you basically have these wealthy white landowners exploiting humans, and controlling them, forcing them to do labor for nothing, enforcing that the labor be done through violence, families being broken up, children being sold off to other owners. This was being done in front of their parents. Their siblings would all, there's accounts of that you can read, of people seeing their siblings and their children being auctioned off to other slave owners and knowing full well that they will most likely never see their child or their brother or sister ever again. So you basically have people brought to a whole nother continent, seized, forced in horrible conditions on these boats, and brought to a new continent. Many died in horrible, horrendous, really horrendous conditions on those boats, and brought here. And so you have, it wasn't that long ago that really, in the greater scheme of Western or even African history, it really wasn't that long ago that we had human slavery here of Africans. My own history on my dad's side, he did quite a bit of genealogy. I don't know that anybody in his family specifically, but there was another family, the Springer family, in southern New Jersey, a little bit of Delaware. Well, they came over to Delaware at some point, and they married the Lynhams and the Perry. Well, the Lynhams really, and then the Perrys came later. But the Lynhams are part of my dad's mother's family, and they married the Springers, and the Springers most certainly owned slaves. Not a lot. There was an exhibit in the American History Museum of the Springer family. It was really cool. It showed it's cool up to a point, except it had a lot to do with slavery, so that's never cool. It showed part of their dwelling, and they had some diaries and information about the slaves. There was a man, a woman, and a girl, and I don't know if it was clear if the girl was the woman's or not, but I think the man's name was Ace, and the woman's name was Sarah, and I can't remember what the little girl's name was. But they weren't large plantation owners, but they had a farm in southern New Jersey, and then I think they married or the family they married into came over from Delaware, or went over to Delaware, and then that got closer into where my family's from, northern Delaware, northeastern Maryland, Cecil County, Maryland. But Springers had a small farm, so they could afford like 3 slaves. So there would be like smaller farms or medium-sized farms that would have a much smaller size, smaller number of slaves, but they were still there, and looked upon as property. And it's very interesting, the story of the Portuguese ship bringing this first load of slaves. It doesn't say really where it was going, but it was intercepted by British pirates. And the pirates are known for stealing property. And of course, the slaves were stolen, and the slaves for 400 years that exist in this country were thought of as nothing more but chattel, another cattle, something like another form of property, livestock, the property of the slave owner. And so in these plantations, there was, it was set up in a certain structure, and there would be slave drivers, and the slave drivers sometimes were black and sometimes they were white, but and then there were also, and they would enforce the rules of the plantation. And if they were black, they would get favors from the master in return. And then there was also the house slaves that lived often in the same house, but like in a different wing or a different floor than the owners and the owner's family. And they were treated a little better because they were able to live in the house. And often they were of lighter skin. And there was some relations going on there, if you know what I mean. And some of those little children that were the children house slaves were often offspring of the plantation owner. Jed asked, white indentured servants mostly. Yes, most indentured servants were white, of much more lower class than the landed folk, the landed gentry, I guess you could popularly call them. Uneducated and lower class white folk. Yeah, and most of them worked that period and were able to purchase off or pay off through that servitude their liberation or something. But slaves never had that opportunity. They were slaves. This is what they were going to be for the rest of their lives. And this, like I said, this was not that long ago. If you look at the arc of history in North America, Western civilization, whatever, it wasn't that long ago. Like Muhammad Ali, who just passed away, like a year and a half ago, he's the grandson of slaves. So really, Muhammad Ali just passed away a year and a half ago. He was the grandson of slaves. And I'm going to show you a little later on folks that are still alive that remember witnessing lynching. Remember a friend of theirs that they went to school with seeing him lynched. And so there's still some of those folks still alive. So really, there's the whole historical aspect that disgusts me, that there's people that's calling themselves progressives that are saying we need to move beyond this, or I don't have time to learn about racism. I don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about racism. You're just being divisive. This all kind of like, let's sweep it under the rug shit is nonsense, because we're not far away from this, and we still are within a white supremacist system. I was actually impressed, the mainstream media. I know a lot of so-called people, and not so-called people, but people in the so-called progressive movement poo-poo the mainstream media and blah, 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 blah. And there's a lot of shit that the mainstream media does. But I was actually impressed that they covered this story. Let me see, I'm going to play this. This was a cop in Jacksonville this week. Stopping a man for jaywalking, threatening him with arrest, giving him a large ticket for that, and then trying to give him a ticket and, again, threatening him with arrest for not carrying an ID with him, and simply for walking down the street. And being a black man, of course. Can you imagine this white cop would never, ever stop a young white man and give him this amount of shit? So it turned out he absolutely lied. There's absolutely no reason a pedestrian needs to be carrying their ID on them. That's for motorists only, and this guy was clearly not a motorist. He was not at all operating a car at the time this whole incident happened.
What was it that we did wrong, officer?
Here we go.
Crossed. Take your camera and point it across there at the red hand. That is a crosswalk. One, you weren't in the crosswalk. Two, there was a red sign. You both crossed. Oh, my bad. That's a $65 ticket apiece. Get to my car. You are being legally detained. If you don't, you are disobeying. I'm going to put you in jail.
No, that's against the law right there. You gotta see. Look.
You look at me. If you don't walk to that car, I'm in jail.
I can cross from the street, officer. That's.
Can I just get a one? So I'm just going to get to my car. You're going to walk to my car. I'm about to put you in jail.
For what?
Disobeying a direct order.
That's not disobeying a direct order.
Resisting without.
That's not
walk to my car.
That is not resisting, officer. That is not resisting.
Listen to me. I am doing you a favor. I'm not telling you again.
I'm doing you a favor. That's great, yeah.
You got your ID on you?
No, I don't.
What's your name?
Vontae Ship.
All right, so there's another infraction. In the state of
Liar.
you have to have an ID card on you identifying who you are. I can detain you up to 7 hours until I can figure out who you are.
Not if I've done anything. Not if I've done anything illegal, officer. No, sir. You cannot.
did do something illegal. You crossed the crosswalk.
Yeah, that's I crossed the crosswalk.
Against a red hand.
I
I was sitting right there.
Oh, he was in the crosswalk. It wasn't even jaywalking then.
Like
Oh my
just
god.
committed a serious crime. That's worth this time right now.
It is worth the time.
Oh my god. Okay, I wasn't sure I was going to go into that because I'm supposed to be sticking with history here, and I got a little sidetracked. But I get kind of irate when there's people that call themselves progressives and have like a following and just poo-poo, saying that we're just sowing division by trying to address issues of racism and systematic white supremacy. So what happened then is that slavery expanded greatly in 1750s, 1770s, 1780s, and then you get into the 19th century, and it's really huge. And you start, there's stories of slave uprisings, but those, the channels of communication weren't great back then. There's still a book I want to read about a really huge slave rebellion that happened in Louisiana. And it ended up more than 250 slaves were executed. It was put down, but it was, it took off for a while there, and it was really incredible. And Haiti is a nation that came about through slave rebellion, actually. A really interesting history with Haiti. So you have all this going on, and you have this push. I was talking about how the initial frontier was really like where West Virginia is now, western Pennsylvania, a little bit Ohio, and like Tennessee, and that was like the early frontier. And then they start pushing further out west, and so again there becomes this debate like, will the western states become slave states as well or not? And there a little bit of fighting in Kansas happens. One white religious guy, really radical, named John Brown, and two of his sons are involved in some of that fighting in Kansas. And they come back and they try and lead a rebellion. They try and recruit some slaves. Some slaves aren't really trusting them and going with it. Like, who is this crazy white man? But I think they did have a couple slaves with them when they took the Harper's Ferry, the Army depot in Harper's Ferry, and there's this huge shootout, and then John Brown one of his sons is killed in the shootout, and then soon afterwards there's a quick trial, and John Brown is hanged in nearby Charlestown, West Virginia, which is all pretty close to here. And I lived in the Eastern Panhandle for a little while there and was a reporter just a little bit slightly west of Charlestown and Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry is a beautiful place, and you can still see the old like Army Depot building and all that, like where he was, they surrounded him. There was this huge shootout. He was trying to actually steal a lot of the armaments to then arm slaves, and there were talk about forming a nation up in the Blue Ridge Mountains of largely self-liberated slaves that were going to be given these guns by John Brown and his folk. And there was some communication with Douglass, Frederick Douglass, about helping to form that nation. And I think Frederick Douglass sort of like didn't know what to make of John Brown, but Frederick Douglass in a lot of ways was more reformist. Then you have somebody like Nat Turner, like really wanting to lead a full rebellion, being more radical. John Brown, of course, being more radical. And Frederick Douglass more wanting to work within the system, though he was completely an abolitionist, but it was sort of more of a reformist approach. So that what happened in Harper's Ferry is often seen as a precursor to the Civil War. 1852, that happens. And then, tensions mount in Capitol Hill with debates about, allowing Kansas in and then Nebraska in. And, Kansas was below, is it the 30th? So the 30th parallel or 32nd parallel latitude line, which separates Kansas from Nebraska. So, like, Kansas was let in as, like, slaves, but there's a huge debate over it, fighting, but Nebraska would be a free state. So all this tension happens, and there's threats of the South, which relied on the plantation economy threatening to succeed, and eventually do after shots are fired at Fort Sumter in 1861. Fort Sumter along the coast of South Carolina. And it was the South Carolinians that fired first, and that was the start of the Civil War. So there's no doubt the Civil War was about slavery. It was, people will say, well, it was about the North and South, the South being agricultural and the North being this great burgeoning industrial structure. So it was like the new world, industry versus the older world, agriculture. Well, what's behind that? Is the agriculture was reliant upon large numbers of slaves, free labor, and that system being propped up by slave patrols and slave drivers and police. The police departments are organized essentially the same way that slave patrols were organized, to make sure that slaves weren't escaping, that slaves were behaving themselves, and if they needed to have the hell whipped out of them, they would, to keep down Africans and demean them, disempower them, so they wouldn't try to flee, they wouldn't try and uprise. And lynchings, and, executing slaves, sometimes, really ornery slaves or disobedient slaves would be strung up on a tree right there for all the other slaves to see. It's like, this is what's going to happen to you. So lynching continues well after the Civil War. So the Civil War finally concludes 1864 and the signing of the surrender, Lee and Grant at Appomattox in Virginia. But before that, there's some actually black regiments fighting. One of the most famous, I believe, is the 57th from Massachusetts. You can see the movie Glory. It's about them. And that's, a good movie. I think Denzel Washington, did he win that? I think he won for that. Or he was certainly nominated for Oscar. Really good movie. So blacks were able to fight against the South. It's pretty powerful. I mean, it wasn't in huge numbers, but there were a few regiments, definitely. And they played some important roles during some battles. So then you have Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War. The South is completely defeated. The Republicans are still in power. Lincoln is assassinated in 1865 by John Wilkes Booth, a white supremacist, really angered, disgruntled actor that had some fame. And then Grant was, Johnson was awful president. He was Lincoln's vice president at that point. He was impeached. And then you had Grant, the leader of the Northern Army during the Civil War, was president, another Republican. So the Republicans basically wanted to make sure that the South learned its lesson, and blacks were beginning to be elected to office, town councils, state legislatures, even the Senate. So let me read you a little bit of information about that, because I can't keep all the numbers inside my head. So here we go. During the Reconstruction, many scholars have identified more than 1,500 African American office holders during the Reconstruction era, 1863 to 1877. Historian Cantor Brown Jr. noted that in some states, such as Florida, the highest number of African Americans were elected or appointed to offices. After 1876 and the end of Reconstruction, the following is a partial list of the most notable office holders pre-1900. I was just going to click on U.S. senators. I believe there were 2 African-American senators that were elected during Reconstruction. So, I mean, it's really dramatic. I mean, the Civil War ends 1863, and during the Civil War, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, effectively freeing slaves, though it took a while for that news to travel and for the slaves to be finally freed. It was June 19th. Juneteenth is a big celebration because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation like April, and it wasn't until like mid-June that the last slaves were officially free and found out that the Emancipation Proclamation had even been issued. Let me see. No African Americans served in federal elective office before the ratification in 1870, that starts Reconstruction period, of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 15th Amendment prohibits the federal and state governments from denying any citizen the right to vote because of the citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Of the 10 senators, 6 were popularly elected, including one that previously had been appointed by his state's governor. 2 were elected by the state legislature prior to the ratification of the 17th Amendment. Oh, interesting. To the United States Constitution. Oh, in 1913. Okay, before it became like... Before 1913, senators were not elected by popular vote. That's often forgotten. So anyway, so back to the point. Oh, yes. The first 2 African-American senators represented the state of Mississippi during the Reconstruction era, following the American Civil War. Hiram Rhodes Revels, the first African-American to serve, was elected by the Mississippi State Legislature to succeed Albert G. Brown, who resigned during the Civil War. Some members of the United States Senate opposed his being seated based on the court case Dred v. Scott Sanford, 1857, by the Supreme Court of the United States, claiming that Revels did not meet the citizenship requirement. Oh, gee, you can't be a citizen, you're black. But the majority of senators voted to seat him. The Mississippi State Legislature elected Blanche Bruce in 1875, but Republicans lost power of the Mississippi State Legislature in 1876. Bruce was not elected to a second term in 1881. In 1890, the Democratic-dominated state legislature passed a new constitution disenfranchising most black voters. So, you have this huge step forward with Reconstruction. The whites, as soon as they're no longer like held down and humiliated because of their loss during the Civil War rise up and say, oh, we can't have any of that. So let's fully enforce white supremacy again to the hilt. Every other southern state also passed disenfranchising constitutions by 1908, excluding African Americans from the political system in the entire former Confederacy. This situation persisted into the 1960s until after federal enforcement of constitutional rights under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that's what I'm going to get into in my next part of this series. But let me just read you a little more detail here about the end of Reconstruction, how it all ended. Compromise of 1877, but some people call it 1876. But here, immediately after the presidential election of 1876, so it still would be 1876 there because the election's in November, it became clear that the outcome of the race hinged largely on disputed returns from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the only three states in the South with Reconstruction-era Republican governors still in power. As a bipartisan congressional commission debated over the outcome early in 1877, allies of the Republican Party candidate Rutherford Hayes met in secret with moderate Southern Democrats in order to negotiate acceptance of Hayes' election. So it was this whole negotiation, again, based on white supremacy. The Democrats agreed not to block Hayes' victory on the condition that Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South, thus consolidating Democratic control over the region. As a result of the so-called Compromise of 1877, and then parentheses, or Compromise of 1876, probably was during 1876, as I said, it was right after the election, it was behind closed doors, all this shit. So as a result of that, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina became Democratic once again, effectively marking the end of the Reconstruction era. So the Democrats controlled all the South, and the Republicans, again, were like all Northern is about disconnect there, just reconnect. As many Southern whites had resorted to intimidation and violence to keep blacks from voting and restore white supremacy in the region. Beginning in 1873, a series of Supreme Court decisions limited the scope of Reconstruction-era laws and federal support for the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, particularly the 14th and 15th, which gave African Americans the status of citizenship and the protection of the Constitution, including the all-important right to vote. So yeah, I mean, they began to peel it away, and then it was just sort of done away with in 1876. So that's where I'm going to end this part of this part 2 of my Racism 101 for white folk. I'm going to try not to talk about certain problematic folks and an incident that happened in Richmond recently, an anti-war conference, because really, when it comes to the progressive movement, those folks don't matter, and I don't really want to give them any more attention than they've already garnered for themselves. And that's what largely they are, and that's my problem with a lot of the white privileged live streamers in this so-called progressive movement, is it's all about clicks and their own fame and their narcissism. So to lead into my second part, which will be coming up in a few more days, part 3 of Racism 101 for white folk, I'm going to end up with, I'm going to show you this interesting video here. So here we go.
In one of America's most shameful chapters, thousands of African Americans, no one will ever know how many, were lynched. For 2 sisters who witnessed the lynching, memories still haunt. 94-year-old Catherine Fletcher will never forget how her one-time classmate was murdered in St. Joseph, Missouri, 8 decades ago.
They chained him to the back of a car and dragged him up and down the main street in the black neighborhood, screaming, this will happen to you and so-and-sos. Then they hanged him to a tree and set a fire to him and burned his body.
Throughout the country, from the Civil War era well into the 20th century, African-American men, women, even some whites, were lynched, their bodies often shot, mutilated, and burned. Catherine Fletcher's 92-year-old sister, Correa Strouder, remembers what a mob in Maryville, Missouri did to a black man accused of killing a white woman.
They decided to put him, chain him on the roof of the school and then set the school on fire. There was no evidence that this man was involved with her at all, but they had to pick up somebody.
Catherine Fletcher is one of over 70 elderly African Americans interviewed by the Reverend Angela Sims for her Remembering Lynching project housed at Baylor University's Institute of Oral History.
If we don't capture the narratives now, they will be lost to history forever.
Angela Sims, who teaches ethics and black church studies at St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City, Missouri, spent 2 years interviewing African Americans who grew up in what theologian James Cone calls the shadow of the lynching tree. They either witnessed a lynching, lived in fear of one, or, in the case of 92-year-old Willie Matthew Thomas, narrowly escaped being lynched.
So one of them said, well, look, are we going to hang him? Yes, we not. And another said, sure, we going to hang him. And so he made up the noose, and they put it around my neck. And I remember in the Bible, it speaks about how they treated Jesus, and they said they led him away to be crucified. They led me away to be crucified, to be hung.
Thomas was saved when a white man who knew his family showed up with a shotgun and intervened. Dr. Sims got the idea for her project when she heard a speech about lynching by retired minister the Reverend Wallace Hartsfield Sr., now 83. He was only 8 or 9, living in Georgia, when he peered from behind a curtain and saw a mob.
They had taken the man out, and they had used his body for gun practice, and then they had hanged him, and then cut him down and then dragged him through the street. And this is supposed to be a warning to uppity niggas.
Photographs were made of lynchings, then turned into postcards.
What do we
postcards to send to friends, relatives, commemorating lynchings. It's pretty sick. And, when they had these lynchings, like I said, it wasn't that long ago. They were still going on. And this year, nooses were fashioned at American University, then in some black neighborhood, predominantly black neighborhoods in D.C. So we got a lot of issues, folks. And we got to look out for our allies and our accomplices in this movement. If we ever want to get to a point of a strong left movement, I'm not even sure I'm going to use the term progressive anymore, a strong left movement, and to help build that coming people's popular uprising, we're going to have to look out and watch the backs of our friends, allies, comrades, accomplices, whatever. We have to. And we have to educate ourselves, and we have to educate each other about the totality of white supremacy in this system of exploitive capitalism and imperialism. And so, like I said before, white supremacy and racism is sort of the other side of that. That's always there. And we have to fight against it. Again, if you call yourself progressive, you have to be concerned about issues of justice. You have to. That's what being a progressive is. So, until next time, thanks for tuning in. Good night.